Hey boys and girls, today we're going to be continuing with chapters 13 and 14. Today I thought I would turn it so that you can actually see the chapter with me to read along. So chapter 13, Strong Winds in the Forecast. Mr. Larson was on his way out of the building on Tuesday afternoon, briefcase in one hand, red thermos in the other, when he heard the unmistakable sound of Dr. Barnes's voice. "Mr. Larson! Mr. Larson!" Dr. Barnes was trotting down the hall toward him, puffing, his face red. Turning around, Mr. Larson managed to put a neutral expression on his face. He said, "Hi, Phil. How's it going?" Dr. Barnes winced. He preferred to be called Dr. Barnes or Principal Barnes. Mr. Larson always called him Phil. "What are you doing?" Dr. Barnes asked incredulously. "It's 3:30. Thought I'd go home for the night," said Mr. Larson. Patting his forehead with a handkerchief, Dr. Barnes said, "Didn't you get my memo? We have a meeting today, right now, and you're 15 minutes late." Said Mr. Larson. "I guess I didn't get your note." "But how could you have missed it? Mrs. Cormier put it in your mailbox on Friday afternoon. Didn't you get your mail this morning?" Mr. Larson smiled and shrugged. "Guess not." Dr. Barnes turned and motioned, and Mr. Larson began following him down the hall toward the office. Dr. Barnes said, "I'm glad I caught you. You're supposed to get your mail every morning, you know. Your mailbox is an important channel of faculty communication." With a straight face, Mr. Larson said, "You know, I've heard that, Phil. But it's remarkable how many days I get by just fine without going to the office at all." Dr. Barnes ignored this comment and opened the door that went directly into his office from the hallway. He held the door, letting Mr. Larson squeeze past him to go in first. Shutting the door, Dr. Barnes motioned to the chair in front of his desk. Mr. Larson put his thermos and briefcase on the floor beside the chair, sat down, and crossed his long legs. It was not a comfortable chair. Mr. Larson wondered how many other squirming people had sat across from Principal Barnes this way. On the principal's desk was a prism of wood engraved Philip K. Barnes, B.A., M.E.D., M.B.A., Ed.D. On the paneled wall behind his chair, framed diplomas and certificates competed for space with photographs of Dr. Barnes shaking hands with important people, some of whom Mr. Larson could actually recognize. Ambition oozed from every photograph. Dr. Barnes unfolded his copy of the Landry News and slid it across the desk toward Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson saw his name there, circled in red ink. The principal said, "Tell me, Mr. Larson, what exactly is your involvement with this newspaper?" Mr. Larson put on his reading glasses, looked down at the paper, and then up at Dr. Barnes. "I'm teaching a unit on journalism," said Mr. Larson, "and some of the kids in the class have started a newspaper, sort of as a project. It's good writing, don't you think?" "Yes," said Dr. Barnes, "the writing is fine. That's not the problem." "Problem?" said Mr. Larson. "I didn't know there was any sort of problem. What problem are you talking about, Phil?" Dr. Barnes leaned back in his chair and began gently swiveling from side to side, with his eyes staying steady on Mr. Larson's face. "Are you familiar with the Supreme Court decision known as the Hazelwood case?" Mr. Larson immediately replied, "Hazelwood, of course. In 1988, the United States Supreme Court ruled that school principals have the legal right to say what does or does not get printed in school newspapers. It was not a unanimous decision, but 5 justices agreed that a school principal has this authority. Some people think the court's decision is a violation of the Constitution's guarantee of free speech. Others say that if the school is the publisher, the school gets to make the final decisions, just like the owner of a newspaper would." Dr. Barnes was impressed. He had underestimated just how well-read and well-informed Mr. Larson was. Nodding, he said, "You have a clear grasp of the case, I see. And tell me, Mr. Larson, do you agree with the court's decision?" Mr. Larson smiled and said, "That's kind of like asking if I agree with the law of gravity. Whether I agree with it or not, it's still the law." Dr. Barnes chuckled. "True, quite true. The law is the law, and since it is, then I assume you will not mind if I review each new edition of this paper before it is distributed, correct?" Mr. Larson kept smiling, but there was no smile in his voice. He said, "If it was a school newspaper, I wouldn't mind that at all. But you see, Phil, it's not. The Landry News is a classroom newspaper. It's made by my students in room 145, and I have every confidence in their ability to decide what ought to be in it." Leaning forward so that his stomach pressed against the desk, Dr. Barnes pointed at the newspaper. He said, "If this is a classroom newspaper, all the copies should have stayed in your classroom, Mr. Larson. Mrs. Cormier found this copy on the floor all the way over in the third grade hallway." "You know, it's a funny thing about paper," said Mr. Larson. "My wife and I once flew to New York City for a long weekend, and after we flew back to Chicago on Sunday night, we walked to our car, drove home, went inside, and then I sat down and put my feet up, and you know what? There was a piece of paper, an advertisement for a New York restaurant, stuck right onto the bottom of my shoe. Paper has a way of getting around." Dr. Barnes did not appreciate the humor in Mr. Larson's story. Frowning, he patted the paper on his desk. "Do you know how many copies of this newspaper were printed?" Mr. Larson shook his head. "No, I can honestly say I do not know how many copies the kids made. I left that up to them. They are proud of their work, and they have a right to be. I'm sure they've shared some copies with their friends, probably carried them home to show their folks, too." 75 copies, said Dr. Barnes. "According to Miss Steinert, your students made 75 copies of this newspaper. You have 23 students in your afternoon class. So unless you are trying to tell me that each child kept 3 or more copies, then this is a school newspaper. This newspaper is produced here in my school using school computers and school paper and school printers and school electricity and school time." Mr. Larson was quiet for a moment. He resisted the urge to start yelling. He wasn't looking for a big fight with Philip Barnes. Never had been. In many ways, he admired the principal. Doc Barnes looked out for what he thought were the best interests of the kids. He tried to keep everyone happy and working together. The teachers and the parents and the school board and the superintendent. Not an easy thing to do. Dr. Barnes was a good principal, a good administrator. But Dr. Barnes was not a good teacher. And Mr. Larson was dead certain that if Dr. Barnes got involved in the Landry News, something important would be lost. Clearing his throat, Mr. Larson stood up. "Well, it's happened before, hasn't it, Dr. Barnes? This is just one more educational matter that you and I disagree about. I say that the Landry News is a classroom project. The paper and printers and computers and time and electricity are being used as a normal part of my work as a teacher in this school, just like any other teacher and any other group of kids doing any other project." Dr. Barnes stood up too, and tapping on the newspaper sheet with his index finger, he asked, "Then you take full responsibility for this newspaper and whatever is printed in it?" "I sure do," said Mr. Larson. "Absolutely." "Very well then," said Dr. Barnes mildly. "I guess our meeting is over." Mr. Larson bent down to pick up his briefcase and his red thermos, and as he did, Dr. Barnes stepped out from behind the desk and pulled open the door to the hallway. As Mr. Larson stepped out into the corridor, Dr. Barnes said, "Mr. Larson, will you please be sure that I get 1 copy of each newspaper as it comes out? I'd like to keep informed of the progress of your classroom project." Next edition comes out this Friday, said Mr. Larson. We'll be sure to get you a copy. Have a good evening, Phil. Closing the door that exited to the hall, Dr. Barnes walked over and opening the other door that went into the main office. Mrs. Colmier, I need you to take a letter for me. Mrs. Colmier looked at the clock. It was 3:43. Be right there, Dr. Barnes. She grabbed her pad and a ballpoint, walked in, and sat where Mr. Larson had been. Dr. Barnes paced slowly behind her and said, This is a memorandum to the personnel file of Mr. Carl Larson. I have just concluded a meeting with Mr. Larson. We discussed a newspaper being produced by students in his classroom, in his afternoon class. It appears to be a school newspaper, and I have asked Mr. Larson to show each copy to me before publication so that any objectionable material can be removed before it is distributed. Mr. Larson has insisted that the newspaper is a classroom newspaper and has taken full responsibility for the contents of each edition. He has agreed to supply me with one copy of each edition that he and his students publish. Stepping over to look over Mrs. Colmier's shoulder, he asked, Did you get all that? Mrs. Colmier nodded. Good, said Dr. Barnes. I'd like 3 copies for signature sometime tomorrow. Thank you, Mrs. Colmier. As she left the office, Dr. Barnes sat down again and swiveled slowly back and forth. His meeting with Mr. Larson had not gone exactly as he had planned, but Dr. Barnes was happy with the results. Very happy. Mr. Larson had accepted full responsibility for the newspaper and everything in it. The more Dr. Barnes thought about that, the better he liked it. All he had to do was wait. One mistake would drop Mr. Larson right into the frying pan.